When a man scarred by crime decides to change his life, the journey to redemption can be more difficult than any challenge he's ever faced. Lucas, a former criminal, finds himself faced with an impossible choice: continue on his dark path or do something great that would change the lives of many. But just when everything seemed to finally be working out, an unexpected turn of events threatens to destroy everything he's achieved. Will he be able to prove that true redemption is possible? Prepare yourself for a story of resilience, courage, and a decision that will leave you breathless. Every story has a beginning, and often those beginnings aren't fairy tales. Lucas, the protagonist of this journey of redemption, wasn't born with a silver spoon in his mouth, nor did he have a childhood of fulfilled dreams. On the contrary, his story was marked by bad choices, devastating consequences, and a path that, to a certain extent, seemed irreversible. Lucas's life was shaped by the streets of a city marked by violence and a lack of opportunities. From a young age, he found himself surrounded by a harsh reality, where crime seemed the only viable option for survival. Opportunities were few, and the temptation to take the easy path was always present. Lucas, like many others, succumbed to the pressure. The desire for power, quick money, and the recognition he never had as a child propelled him into a dangerous world where the rules were clear. Either you play the game, or the game swallows you. He started out small, involved in petty crimes, thefts, and robberies, but his taste for power and the adrenaline of crime led to his rapid rise. From a street drug dealer, he went on to control a distribution network, managing people, money, and power. He became feared, even respected, but like any castle built on sand, his fortress was about to crumble. But how did he get here? How did a man with so many possibilities before him lose himself completely to crime? The answer lies in his decisions. And Lucas's decisions weren't by far the best. When Lucas got involved in drug trafficking, he thought he had everything under control. He was smart, agile, able to evade authorities and stay one step ahead of everyone. But no one is truly in control when they choose to follow the path of illegality. The game of power and money is seductive, but it demands much more than you can give, and Lucas began to pay the price for his choices. Over the years, Lucas began to lose who he truly was. He lost friends who died or were somehow consumed by the world they lived in. The connections he built were not based on loyalty, but on interest, and when the interest faded, the loyalty faded. He was no longer a man with a family and dreams, but a prisoner of his own chosen lifestyle. But things didn't get any easier. Lucas became entangled with powerful enemies who, when threatened, didn't hesitate to retaliate. Because of his choices, he found himself in increasingly dangerous situations, until he finally lost control. One fateful night, just as he was about to sign a major deal with an international cartel, Lucas received devastating news: an attack. His home was invaded, his family threatened, and he narrowly escaped death. But the price was high. Anger overcame him, and the pain drove him to make even bigger mistakes, further alienating the few people who truly cared about him. It was at this point, when the pain and emptiness seemed unbearable, that Lucas realized the gravity of his situation. He was so immersed in chaos and fear that he could no longer even recognize himself. What happened to the dreamer who once wanted to be someone better? What happened to the young man full of hope and the desire to change the world? All seemed lost. But like every great journey, Lucas's story doesn't end here. Now, you might be wondering, how did he get to this point? What made him make so many bad decisions? The answer isn't simple. What happened to Lucas happens to many people throughout life. In a world where we're often not taught how to deal with adversity in a healthy way, pressure and fear sometimes cause us to take shortcuts, and these shortcuts lead us away from who we truly are. But even at his lowest point, Lucas still had something inside him, the spark of who he truly was, something that not even crime and pain could completely extinguish, something that, when the time was right, would lead him to make the most important decision of his life. Now the question is, how will he get back on his feet? How will he reverse all the harm he's caused to his life and society? This story is just beginning. And if you're curious to learn how a man, marked by pain and past mistakes, can change his destiny and do something great for society, keep reading. Prepare to see how Lucas, faced with darkness, chose the path of redemption. If you're touched by this story and want to learn more about how Lucas faces his demons, be sure to like the video, subscribe to the channel, and share it with someone who also needs to hear about the importance of redemption and overcoming. Your journey to change begins now, and together we can witness this life transformation. Click the like button and subscribe to the channel so you don't miss any detail of Lucas's story. Every step of his journey is a reminder that it's never too late to change and make a difference. It was a cold, silent night, typical of a city that never sleeps but always suffers in silence. Lucas was at home alone, reflecting on the mess his life had become. Cigarette smoke hung in the air as he tried to drown out the memories of one wrong decision after another. With each tragedy, each mistake, the weight on his chest grew, but he always believed he could hold on. Until that night. The phone rang. It was a number he'd never expected, but one that had become inevitable. The sharp sound cut through the stillness, and he, with a weary expression, answered without hesitation. On the other end of the line, a voice trembled, almost unrecognizable, but with a clear urgency. "Lucas, it's Carla. Something happened to Anna." Anna. Her name echoed in Lucas's mind like a punch to the gut. Anna was his sister, the only person he still genuinely cared about. Despite all the chaos he wreaked around him, she was always there, trying to support him in some way, even knowing how dark and dangerous he had become. Carla, his younger brother's wife, couldn't continue the conversation. Her desperate cries choked her words. Lucas knew something terrible had happened. Deep down he feared the truth, but it was impossible to hide from his own guilt. He didn't know how, but in an instant he was driving, his hands trembling on the steering wheel, the headlights cutting through the darkness, while his mind replayed the worst-case scenarios. Every mile felt like an eternity. The sound of the rain hitting the glass sounded like a doomsday drum, and the weight of what was to come tightened his chest. Arriving at Carla's house, the scene was already set. Those flashing lights, the ambulances, the police. But what hurt most, what tore at his heart, was the silence of his mother, who stood there, quiet, as if she already knew what he would find. That's when he entered the room and saw his sister, pale, lying on the bed, her eyes closed. The emptiness in his chest expanded like a black hole. His mother's muffled, drawn-out cry was the final slap that shattered the facade he had built for himself. Lucas approached, and in that instant, the whole world stopped. His sister was no longer there. She was gone, the victim of an overdose, a direct result of her own involvement in drug trafficking. She had never been involved in crime, but Lucas knew. He knew that somehow she paid the price for her life, for her bad choices. There, before the thing he loved most, he felt the weight of guilt, shame, and regret. The silence was no longer peaceful. It was an unbearable scream. The pain he felt in that moment went beyond any physical suffering he had ever experienced. It was a mental, emotional pain that consumed every inch of his being. And for the first time in years, he saw, with absolute clarity, the true consequences of his choices. Tears streamed from his eyes, but they weren't just tears of sadness. They were tears of a man who finally found himself at rock bottom, with no escape. He couldn't go back, couldn't change what had happened, but something inside him was awakening. He looked at his sister, his mother, his destroyed life, and for the first time Lucas asked himself, "Is there still something I can do to save what's left of me?" The emotional impact was so profound that he didn't know if the pain outweighed the shame or vice versa. But one thing he knew for sure, that pain, that moment, would change his life forever. As he left the room, the police began their work. Lucas's mother, distraught, couldn't stop crying. But in that moment, he felt his own heart had also died a little. He was there, physically present, but his soul, his will to live, seemed to have departed along with Anna. He sat on the living room sofa, his eyes lost in space, his hands clasped tightly against his head. He didn't know where to begin. He didn't know how to escape this nightmare, but he knew something in his heart had broken. There, with his thoughts clouded and a crushing weight on his shoulders, Lucas had no answers. He only felt a searing pain, a sadness so profound he'd never imagined he could feel it. But at the same time, deep within him, there was a flicker of something he'd never experienced before, the desire to change. He stood, looking at his mother and the remains of a life he had destroyed without realizing it. He didn't know how he would do it, but in that moment, with the pain and guilt coursing through his veins, he knew one thing. If there was a chance, any chance, he would do everything in his power to do something great, not to redeem himself, but to save what remained of his humanity. Now, with Anna's tragedy seared into his heart, Lucas's true test began, and he knew that if there was any chance for change, this was his last. The pain of losing Anna was such a devastating blow that Lucas at first didn't know how to process it. Every thought that crossed his mind made him feel dirtier, further away from everything that could have been. He couldn't stop reliving the moment he saw his sister for the last time. She was there stretched out, her life slipping away, and he stood there helpless, watching it all happen, powerless to change anything. That night, Lucas couldn't sleep. He spent hours sitting on the edge of his bed, staring at the ceiling, as if hoping to find some meaning in that void. His eyes burned from crying, and his mind was a whirlwind, a mixture of regret and frustration. There was no going back. There was no fixing what he had destroyed. He thought about the choices he'd made, the number of lives he'd affected, the friends he'd lost, the enemies he'd made. But the truth that tormented him most was that he'd dragged his sister into this hell with him. Anna, who had never been involved in the crime, was now dead, not because of her, but because of him, because of the decisions he'd made. He knew this, and it consumed him. The weight of regret became unbearable. Deep down, he knew the chances of making amends were slim to none. But like every human being, he tried to ignore that accusing inner voice, tried to distract himself with other things. Work, false friendships, the constant pursuit of power and money. But none of it made sense now. Lucas sat at the kitchen table, his gaze lost in the cold, long-forgotten cup of coffee. He picked up his cigarette and lit it, letting the smoke fill his lungs, trying to escape the feeling of helplessness. Every tragedy he had ever faced seemed small compared to the pain he felt now. He had everything, and yet he had lost what truly mattered, and deep down he knew that this pain was not something he could drown or forget. It was then that, for the first time, he allowed himself to confront who he truly was. Not the man who pretended to be tough, the criminal who seemed immune to the world, but the wounded man who felt alone and lost. He was no longer the 20-something kid who believed he could control the world. He was no longer the drug lord, the respected man on the streets. He was simply a broken man, facing the consequences of his own life. The first few minutes were silent, just the sound of Lucas's heavy breathing and the distant patter of rain falling on the street. But as the silence deepened, Lucas began to hear the words his mind had long tried to ignore. He knew that somehow the pain of losing Anna was a reflection of the pain he had carried for years, the pain of being lost, aimless, without purpose. He rose from his chair, walking to the window, looking out at the city. That never stopped. Life continued outside, but he was stagnant, trapped in something of his own making. And deep down, Lucas knew, if he didn't do something now, his own existence would also be consumed by darkness. It was then that he realized how different his life could be, how much he could still change, not for himself, but for everyone who could still be impacted by his actions. He found himself facing a moral dilemma, a turning point where his choices could mean the difference between continuing to sink or trying to climb out of the abyss. Doubt gripped him. Is it worth trying to change? Is it worth seeking redemption, even knowing that the past is impossible to erase? The ghosts of his old life began to haunt him, the scenes of the people he'd betrayed, the friends he'd destroyed. But at the same time, he felt there was a chance for something greater, something he'd never had before, the possibility of doing good, of being someone defined not by his mistakes, but by the actions he chose from now on. He sat back down, this time with more clarity. Something inside him was beginning to stir, something he hadn't felt in a long time. He thought of Anna again, and how she believed in a better future, how she always wanted him to be a different person. Maybe that was the key. Maybe he could finally be the man she always wanted him to be. It was at that moment that Lucas made his decision. He knew there was no easy path to redemption. He knew society would never see him the same way. But when he looked in the mirror, he was no longer interested in what the world thought of him. What mattered now was who he chose to be. What would he do to stop being just a reflection of his mistakes and become someone capable of doing something great for others? The decision was made. He knew that true redemption wouldn't come from a change of appearance, nor from an easy forgiveness. It would come from action. And with that, Lucas finally understood that, to redeem himself, he would have to fight against his own nature, against the ghosts of the past, and give everything he had to a new purpose. He stood, facing the road ahead. The first step would be difficult, but Lucas knew the path to redemption began with the decision to no longer be who he had been, and no matter how uncertain the future, he was ready to face it head-on. Lucas woke up that morning with the feeling that something inside him had shifted. The weight on his chest, the constant pain of loss, everything felt lighter, as if a veil were beginning to lift. But he knew that true change wouldn't come with mere reflections or empty promises. He needed to act. The decision he'd made the night before couldn't just be a momentary escape from reality. It had to be something real, something concrete. He got out of bed, put on his old jacket, the one he used to wear on nights working the streets, and looked at himself in the mirror. The man he saw was no longer the criminal he once was. But he wasn't a completely new man either. He was a mix of chills, hope, and the emptiness of what he still needed to achieve. He knew the change would begin from there, with the small actions he took to transform the pain into something positive. The first step was simple, but the hardest of all, seeking help. He knew that to change, he would need someone by his side. He couldn't do it all alone, not anymore. So he went to an old local NGO, the one that helped young people at risk of entering the world of crime. Lucas knew the place, but he had never approached it closely, never had any reason to. When he entered the room, the reception area was quiet, the sound of computers and the hum of printers filling the room. He hesitated for a moment, feeling the gaze of one of the receptionists fix on him. It was clear he wasn't welcome there. His heavy steps, his gaze hardened by time, everything about him screamed strange. But he didn't back down, not this time. He approached the receptionist, a middle-aged woman with a kind but suspicious smile. She stared at him for a few seconds before asking, "Can I help you?" Lucas swallowed hard and with a hoarse voice replied, "I want to help." She arched an eyebrow in surprise, but didn't ask any immediate questions. Instead, she just watched him, waiting for him to finish his sentence. I want to help young people. Show them what I learned the hard way, so they don't make the same mistakes I did. I don't have much to offer, but I want to change." It was as if he'd dropped a bomb on the room. The receptionist was silent for a few seconds, her eyes scrutinizing him, trying to figure out if he was serious or just trying to show off. Lucas knew no one would believe him right away, not even himself. But something inside him burned, something strong enough to keep going. "If you're truly willing to change and help, we have some guidance for you," the woman replied in a softer voice. She led him to a small office in the back of the NGO, where he had the opportunity to speak with one of the program coordinators. In that conversation, Lucas explained what he had done, his criminal background, and ultimately, his desire to help. He knew that in many places he would be seen as a monster, someone who should never be given a second chance. But he had to try. The coordinator, a bald man with a thick beard, looked at him intently. The minutes seemed like hours, but finally the man spoke. "We all make mistakes. Lucas, what matters is what we do next. We can help you, but you need to be willing to give it your all to make it work. You'll have to be an example. You'll have to give your life for it, day after day." Those words fell upon him like a heavy rain. Lucas didn't know if he could bear it. He was afraid, but for the first time in a long time, something inside him was driving him forward. He accepted the conditions. He no longer wanted to be the man who destroyed. He wanted to be the man who helped rebuild. The first few days were the hardest. Lucas began working directly with a group of young people on the verge of entering the world of crime. He knew them, smelled the fear and anger in them, the same feelings that had consumed him in his youth. But the biggest challenge was gaining their trust. Most saw him as an imposter, a man who, like everyone else, came from the same street, with the same vices. They didn't understand why someone like him was there. But Lucas was determined. He didn't want to be that man, that criminal. And he knew that if he didn't do his best, the young people would never believe him. So he began to share his story, unvarnished, unapologetic. He told of the wrong choices, the lost friends, the broken families, and the deep pain of loss. He wasn't there to be a hero. He was there to be honest, real, and to show that even after falling, there's always a chance to get back up. Over time, some began to listen. Lucas began to see something. In the young people's eyes, a spark of hope. They didn't know if they could trust him, but they felt that perhaps he was their only chance of not getting lost. He became more than a mentor. He became a guide, someone who could show them that life wasn't just about victories, but also about failures and new beginnings. And with each day, Lucas found himself closer to his own redemption. He wasn't there to erase his past, but to create something better, something that would make the pain worthwhile. In the first few months, progress was slow. Some young people left and returned to the world of crime. But Lucas didn't give up. He knew that everyone's journey was unique, and he needed to be there, even in the most difficult moments. As the months passed, he began to notice a true change, not only in his students but also in himself. With each life he touched, with each story he helped rewrite, he felt that true redemption lay not just in his words, but in his actions. He was no longer the criminal hiding behind lies. He was becoming the man he always wanted to be. The change wasn't simple or quick, but it was happening, step by step, life by life, and Lucas knew that in the end, he would be building something far greater than any business or power he had sought in the past. He was building a legacy of change, not for himself, but for all those who might once have been where he was, lost, and who now, perhaps, could find their way back. As Lucas began to take the first steps on his journey of change, one thing became clear. The real battle was not just within himself, but also outside, in the society that watched him with a skeptical and suspicious eye. In the first few days after starting to work with young people, Lucas felt a small hope blossom within him. He believed more than ever that he was on the right path. But this hope was soon challenged by the reality of how society viewed him. The streets he had walked for years, where he was known to everyone, didn't see him as the reformed man he wanted to be. Instead, he was the ex-criminal, the man who, in people's minds, should never be given a second chance. When Lucas first showed up at the NGO's meetings, there was a sense of distrust in the air. Some of the older staff, still stuck in the stereotypes his name carried, kept their distance. And the young people he was trying to help? Many of them were more concerned about his having been a boss than about what he was doing now. He's just another person trying to escape social confinement, doing good to clean up his image, they whispered in the streets, out of earshot. But still, he heard them. The words echoed in his mind, eroding his confidence. He couldn't blame them, but that didn't make the pain any easier to bear. The city didn't look at him with forgiving eyes, and Lucas knew it. When he first saw him in the square, the look on people's faces was clear. You have no right to do this, on every street corner, in every group of old acquaintances. There was low laughter, whispers, and silent judgment. The same city that had once feared him now despised him, as if he were a threat disguised as a good deed. But the hardest part was the reaction of his own family. His mother, who had always loved him, still seemed to live in denial. Despite her kind words, she couldn't completely trust him to change. It was as if, as much as she wanted him to be the best version of himself, she felt unable to believe he would truly change. The shadow of his past seemed to envelop her in every smile, every gesture of affection. She feared more for the son he had been than for the possibility of the man he was striving to become. Lucas's brother, younger and increasingly removed from the criminal world, was even more reticent. He tried to show support, but his demeanor was marked by doubt. It was as if he was waiting for Lucas to fail so he could say, "I knew you couldn't do it." And then there were Lucas's old friends, those who had shared nights of partying, crime, and dirty laughs. They showed up often, disguised as concern, but deep down they were just waiting for Lucas to return to his old ways. They didn't believe he could truly leave behind the world that defined him. Yet a part of Lucas knew it was inevitable. They saw him as a prisoner of the past, and he would need more than a smile or a change of behavior to prove he was different. The first few months were undoubtedly the hardest. He'd pass by these groups of people and feel their heavy gazes on him. Conversations would cease as he approached, and he knew the world was watching him closely. "He'll fall again, you'll see," people would say silently on the streets. Lucas's problem wasn't just the community's distrust, but the fact that he knew deep down that some of that distrust was justified. He, more than anyone else, knew how low human beings could fall. He knew how much his own shadow would follow him wherever he went. But something was changing inside him. He no longer wanted to prove anything to others but to himself. He knew that in the end it would be his actions that would speak loudest. He might be a man marked by the past, but he would also be a man of consistent action. Time would be his ally, and he was willing to give everything he had to show that he was capable of rebuilding his life, piece by piece. As the community watched him, suspicious and skeptical, Lucas knew the road would be long and full of obstacles. Each new step would have to be taken with renewed strength. He couldn't chase everyone's approval, but he had to seek his own forgiveness. And to do that, he would have to keep going. Even when the world around him disbelieved, he would do whatever it took to move forward. As time passed, Lucas began to understand that his greatest enemy wasn't the community's distrust, but his own internal struggle. He couldn't force people to see his change, but little by little, his actions would speak louder than any judgment. He knew that true transformation didn't come through words or the approval of others. It happened in small decisions, in daily actions, in how he treated life and the people around him. Even with the weight of distrust on his shoulders, Lucas pressed on, determined to show that no matter how difficult, true change always starts from the inside out. The clock struck 6 a.m., and Lucas was already out on the street, as he always did, walking the same avenues where so many feared him. But this time, he wasn't there to participate in dirty dealings, not involved in illicit activities. Instead, he was carrying the weight of a new kind of responsibility, one he didn't know if he could carry for long. He was trying to rebuild his life, not just for himself, but for all the young people who believed in his change. Among these young men, one stood out: João. He was 18 years old, with eyes that reflected a past of pain and a life of wrong choices. He didn't see himself as lost, but Lucas knew that if he didn't reach out to him, João would soon sink into the same abyss he had escaped. Lucas clung to this young man as if he were an extension of his own journey. He believed that if he could save João, he could prove to himself that it was possible to change someone's destiny. For the first few months, it seemed like Lucas's efforts were paying off. João was doing well, beginning to believe he could have a better future. He participated in the NGO's activities, kept busy with work, and even approached Lucas more often for advice. But Lucas knew the real test would come when João was faced with life's difficult choices. Fate, however, has its own rules. One afternoon, while Lucas was busying himself with the NGO's work, he received a phone call that sent chills down his spine. The voice on the line was familiar, but the tone was distant and tense. "Lucas, it's João. He was arrested again. He got involved in something serious. Drug trafficking, Lucas. He's back." The ground seemed to drop away from under Lucas's feet. He didn't want to believe it, but at the same time he knew this moment had arrived. The pain he felt wasn't just disappointment, but a profound sadness, as if the world were crashing down on him. He had invested so much in João. He had believed in him so much, and now everything was crumbling before his eyes. The work of months, of dedicated days, of conversations, advice and hope seemed to have been in vain. Lucas felt the weight of failure brutally. He knew the path to redemption wasn't easy, but he never imagined the loss would be so crushing. Every word from João, every look he'd received with gratitude, now seemed like false comfort. What he feared had happened. The young man he believed he was saving had surrendered himself back to the world of crime. He couldn't understand what had gone wrong. What could he have done differently? He was no longer a criminal, but now he saw himself as a defeated man, powerless in the face of a fate that seemed to repeat itself. He tried to understand what had happened, but nothing made sense. He felt empty, consumed by the pain of not having been able to prevent it. Arriving at the police station where João was being held, Lucas saw the young man sitting with his head bowed, his hands trembling and his eyes glazed, unsure of how to react to everything that had happened. There were no words to comfort him, only the weight of a silence that seemed to encompass the entire room. João looked at Lucas, his expression one of knowing he had disappointed, but at the same time he didn't seem surprised. He knew what he had done, and more than that, he knew what it meant to Lucas. The pain in João's eyes mirrored Lucas's, as if they were both in the same place with no way out. The young man seemed lost, still unable to understand what had led him back down that path of darkness. I don't know what happened, Lucas. I tried, but I came back, João said, his voice breaking, unsure of what to say to justify the unjustifiable. Lucas looked at him, speechless, trying to understand, trying to accept that, as much as he wanted to believe in João's change, it hadn't happened, not in the way he'd hoped. And in that moment, Lucas felt the weight of his own failure. He had dedicated time, love, and trust to João, believing that his own redemption would come through saving others. But he could no longer find the answers within himself. He saw himself more than ever weak, flawed, and incapable of changing what had already been done. The pain of failure was heavier than any guilt he had ever carried. He felt as if he were sinking into the abyss again, but at the same time, there was something inside him that refused to accept defeat. What he was experiencing was not the end, but a painful chapter in the journey. He knew the path to redemption would not be easy, and perhaps never would be. But he couldn't give up now. He had to keep going, not just for João, but for himself. Change wouldn't happen with words alone. He had to fight, persist, and above all, believe that each failure could be the foundation for a new attempt. And it was with this pain, this painful defeat, that Lucas began to understand that true change would never be easy. It would be built from failures, mistakes, and disappointments. What he didn't yet know was that this failure would be the hardest lesson of all, but also the one that would propel him forward, stronger than ever. Lucas stood before João's cell, feeling the weight of despair settle on his shoulders. The young man, once so full of promise, was now trapped in the cycle of crime again, and the pain of this reality crushed him deeply. But something inside Lucas was beginning to shift, and he wasn't sure what it was. In a moment of clarity, he realized he had to make a decision that would not only affect João's life, but also his own journey of redemption. He could simply turn away, claiming he'd done enough, and that John had chosen his path. Many in the community, including some who watched him most suspiciously, expected him to do just that. They wanted Luke to simply accept his failure and move on, without any more pain, without any more loss. But deep down he knew that wasn't the right choice. Looking at João, sitting there, his head bowed, as if carrying the world on his shoulders, Lucas couldn't help but think about what he himself had experienced. He knew, more than anyone, how easy it was to get lost in the streets, how wrong choices can pull us back, even when we're trying to do good. And he couldn't let João's story end that way. Not for him, not for his reputation, but because, somewhere, he believed there was still a chance for this young man. It was then, in the silence of the room with his eyes fixed on João, Lucas made the decision that would change everything. He approached the sheriff's desk, who until then had been watching him with a mixture of doubt and skepticism, as if he too expected Lucas to give up on his young protégé. But what he said next left everyone shocked. "I will take responsibility for him. What he did, I do now. I will take the blame." The police chief looked at Lucas in surprise, unsure how to react. The entire room seemed to freeze, as if time had stopped to make room for this unexpected moment. Lucas knew what he was doing. He was offering his own freedom to ensure João had a second chance. He was putting his life, his reputation, and everything he had built up to that point at risk. "Are you crazy, Lucas?" the police chief asked, his voice a mix of disbelief and anger. "Do you know what you're doing? This isn't going to be easy. You're ruining everything you've accomplished so far." But Lucas was determined. He didn't care about the consequences. He could no longer be the man who shied away from responsibility, the man who only saw others as disposable parts. He knew that the only way to show society that he had truly changed was to go beyond his own limitations, beyond the pain and fear of failure. "Yes," Lucas replied, his voice firm and resolute. "I know what I'm doing, and I'm going to do it, because it's the only way to show that my change is real. Not just to me, but to him too. If he's going to have a chance to change, then I'll be the first to take that step." The police chief, still stunned, didn't know how to react. But Lucas knew this wasn't just a courageous choice, it was a redemptive one. He wasn't just trying to save João, he was trying to save himself. To show that true change doesn't come from words, but from actions, from the difficult choices we must make, even when there's no guarantee of success. The decision was made. Lucas, a man who had already been responsible for so many destroyed lives, now took responsibility for a life he still believed could be saved. He no longer cared about what people thought of him. He no longer worried about his reputation or the judgment of the community. He knew that true redemption came not from doing what was easy, but from doing what was right, even when it seemed impossible. João, who until then couldn't believe what was happening, looked at Lucas with eyes filled with emotion. He didn't know what to say, didn't know how to thank someone for believing so deeply in him, but in that moment, he felt something he'd never felt before. Hope. And perhaps for the first time, João felt he wasn't alone. Lucas, with his decision, was giving himself the opportunity to start over, to try again. And most importantly, Lucas was showing everyone that true change doesn't come just through words, but through the actions we take when life challenges us. He was putting everything he had on the line, not for himself, but for something bigger, the chance for a fresh start, the chance to truly make a difference. He knew that by making this decision, he was giving up his own freedom. But at the same time, he was embracing the true essence of redemption, the ability to sacrifice oneself for the good of another, the courage to rise even when the world around you expects you to fall. The sound of the chains approaching, the police chief's gaze, the fear of the future, all of it seemed distant in that moment, because Lucas finally understood that redemption didn't come from the absence of flaws, but from the willingness to do what's right, even when the world says there's no more chance. He had made the choice. And with it, he was beginning to build something far more powerful than the redemption of a life. He was beginning to rebuild his own soul. The sun was setting that day, as if the sky itself were witnessing the birth of a new life. Lucas stood at the door of the NGO where he had begun his journey, looking out at the busy street, but now feeling a peace he never imagined he would experience. He looked back at all the mistakes he had made, all the tears shed, the sleepless nights, the moments of despair. But now everything seemed to have come to an end, and at the same time a new beginning. The last part of his journey was the most difficult, but also the most liberating. The community that had judged him so much, that watched his every step with suspicion, now saw him differently. It was a long process where it wasn't Lucas's words, but his actions that spoke loudest. He didn't ask for forgiveness, he earned it, with each young person he helped, with each courageous step he took to show that yes, change was possible. Forgiveness came slowly, not all at once, but in small increments. He could see in people's eyes, in the way they began to look at him, that something was changing. The doors of the community began to open. He was no longer seen as the criminal of the past, but as a man who was finally living with purpose, with a commitment to doing good. And as time passed, Lucas realized that the greatest forgiveness he needed didn't come from others. The most important forgiveness was the one he gave himself. For so long he hated himself for the choices he made. For years he believed he could never be anything other than the man he was. But he was wrong. And now he looked in the mirror and saw himself no longer a broken man, but a restored man. He had found true inner peace. Seeing young people who were once lost now rebuilding their lives, hearing stories of overcoming, feeling the warmth of words of gratitude, Lucas understood something he had never understood before. True peace does not come from being perfect, but from being able to get up after falling and do something great for those who still have time to change. The impact of his actions on society was profound. The small community where he lived, once marked by violence and hopelessness, now saw true change, a transformation that went beyond words. Lucas was no longer just a man trying to redeem himself. He became a symbol of hope, living proof that no one, no matter how lost, is irrevocably doomed. Everyone has a chance to start over. His redemption wasn't a straight line, it wasn't a painless path. But pain was what shaped him, what made him understand that true strength comes not from the absence of flaws, but from the courage to look at the shadows of the past and decide to no longer be their slave. Today, Lucas is a free man. Free not because the chains of the past have disappeared, but because he chose to no longer be defined by them. He is free because he took on the burden of responsibility, because he gave himself to those who truly needed him, because he built something more lasting than any wealth or power. He built his peace, his truth. And if you're watching, if you're listening to this story, you might also feel lost. Maybe you're carrying mistakes, guilt, the weight of a past that defines you. But know that, just like Lucas, you too can find the path to redemption. You too can forgive yourself, rebuild yourself, and do something great with what's left. If this story inspired you and you believe redemption is possible like this video, share it with anyone you think needs to hear it. And subscribe to the channel for more stories that show that true strength comes from getting back up, day after day. No matter how far you've come, there's always a chance to start over. True peace begins with the choice to change, and that choice is yours.